Hello, everyone. So, today we'll be talking about international trade and finance. And this presentation is just to give us an insight on the nature of trade and finance globally. What's the nature of economic investment? What's the nature of economic issues specifically that have to do with international relations? How did they begin? What has been the the influence and the level of success so far? What are the critiques? And so on and so forth. So those are the issues we'll be trying to cover in this discussion on international trade and finance. What's the nature of trade? What's the nature of finance on a global level? And how does it affect the states that are involved in these kinds of partnerships? Now, it is almost impossible to separate politics from economics, and that's because the two subjects seem to be mutually dependent on one another. Politics depends on economics. Economics need politics to survive, and you know they're just mutually reinforcing. And so that's why you have specific courses, subjects, disciplines like political economy, that are designed to tell us what is the role of politics in advancing the course of economics for a people, for a state, for an organization, as the case may be. So, international political economy, that's what IPE stands for. So, we'll be using IPE as a short form of international political economy. It's one of the very, very core subjects of international relations. We can't talk about international relations without talking about the economic perspective. What is the nature of economics? What's the nature of finance, trade? In this interaction among states. And so that's what this presentation is basically about. What kind of economic system will deliver the greatest benefit? And this has been a question that has bothered international relations scholars, world leaders, diplomats, for a very, very long time. All right. I've given you already the definition of political economy, how the involvement of the state in economic issues, particularly when the state interest is involved, and of course, interest of other non-state actors that are connected with the state. Okay, so these are some of the things we'll be talking about in this conversation. Obviously, at the end of the Cold War, or since the end of the Cold War, the nature of international political economy has been that of the capitalist-driven economy. So international economy has largely been capitalist-oriented since the end of the Cold War, and of course, the victory of the U.S. over the USSR and the promotion of the capitalist orientation of politics, of economics, society, and so on and so forth. But these have not been without some challenges, and some of the challenges have been integration of post-Cold War economies, post-Soviet economies rather, all those 15 plus states that broke away from the Soviet Union at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. How will these socialist economies be integrated into the larger capitalist-driven international political economy? That has been one challenge, and of course, that is still an ongoing challenge, even though many of them are increasingly being or have reached advanced stages of integration into the capitalist political economy. But that was a major challenge at the time that international political economy suffered. Another challenge was dealing with the rise of superpowers like China, largely socialist communist states, and other Asian states that were not exactly capitalist oriented as well. How would these economies, these nations that are rising or that rose very fast, how would they be incorporated into the global structure? And of course, China has remained one of the five permanent members of the UN, and that has been a very, very significant, a significant point, especially in terms of integrating both capitalist, socialist economies into the entire larger global economy. The rise of growth of political of economic globalization. The expansion of opportunities for economics, expansion of markets, collapse of borders, free trade, free goods and services, free movement of goods and services. All of those are some examples of economic globalization, and that has also been a challenge for a capitalist political economy. One issue that capitalist political economy has had to grapple with is how do we manage the rapidly growing economic globalization. Another issue is how do we ensure economic progress, despite the spikes and levels of violent conflicts that continue to ravage many states, particularly in developing countries like Africa, like developing continents, parts of the world like Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on and so forth. There are several pockets of violent conflicts rather that seem to undermine the growth of economics and the prosperity of economics in this region, and that is also a challenge for the political economic structure. And of course, how do we expand the capacity of international organizations, international institutions, to manage effects that are fallouts of poverty, fallouts of hunger, of starvation, and what have you. So these are some of the challenges, the major issues, that have been a concern for international political economy that is capitalist motivated since the collapse of the Cold War and the rise of the capitalist or the liberal international political economy. So it's important that you bear this in mind as we continue this conversation. Because somehow you would refer back to these challenges and see how they fit into the rest of the conversation. Now, this diagram helps to portray pictorially the structure of a post-Cold War liberal economy. The structure of the post-Cold War liberal economy. Of course, after the UN was established in 1945, other economic financial organizations were established, also around the same period, and they had specific objectives as well. So we'll be talking about these organizations more specifically as we proceed into the conversation. But I just want you to understand that the Bretton Woods system, consists of these three broad organizations: the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and of course the International Development Association, which together constitutes the World Bank Group. And then you have the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade and the World Trade Organization. All right, we'll begin by just a brief overview of the Bretton Woods system. Now, after the First World War, there was a period of global depression, economic depression. It's called the Great Depression. Okay, and many scholars have argued that this was a major factor responsible for the Second World War. The fact that economies did not recover swiftly after the First World War was one major issue that raised tension, and made it possible for states to go back to a war. And so the Bretton Woods system at the end of the Second World War was established to forestall that kind of reoccurrence. And so you had the World Bank, you had the IMF established, GATT established, of course, to render help, to credit-worthy countries, credit-worthy European countries, particularly, and that was a major problem of the Bretton Woods. The fact that the support that was given to credit-worthy countries because they expected those countries to pay back, and it was a major critique against the Bretton Woods system, and so other economic systems were established. You had the Marshall Plan, which was particularly in Europe. You had the Dodge Line, which was in Japan. So these other plans were established, just to render support, particularly to Japan, that was devastated by the Second World War. To Europe, of course, many parts of Europe were also devastated by the Second World War, as well. And so these plans or these systems were the fallouts of the Second World War and the efforts to ensure and achieve global stability in terms of political economy, you know, globally. But in the recent past, we see that the Bretton Woods system has been the one that has survived, so far. And the Bretton Woods system, like we said, is made up of three broad organizations. The International Monetary Fund, established in 1947, and the IMF particularly was established to stabilize exchange rates, was established to secure monetary cooperation, was established to assist countries with short-term liquidity crisis, so basically the IMF was established to address, issues of finance, issues of exchange rates, issues of budget deficits, budgetary issues, provide technical assistance on particularly issues of finance, issues of debt management, debt crisis, financial reporting, those kind of issues that are more financial in nature. Those were the issues that the IMF was established to take care of. All right. And of course, in 2019, the IMF leadership was changed. So the new IMF Director General is Kristalina Georgieva. All right. And of course, the World Bank, also established in the same year, was more concerned with development assistance. How do we assist countries in development projects? How do we assist countries to rebuild after, rebuild damages from the war? And of course, you had other organizations like the Finance Council, International Finance Council. You had the investment guarantee agreement. You had International Committee for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and so on and so forth. So all of these organizations were organizations that were established to ensure that they aided the World Bank in rendering such development assistance to countries that were devastated by the war, and of course other colonies that were, especially European former empires or European former colonies, which include many African societies, African states, as it were, and the last president of the World Bank, just gave way or just exited office 2019, and so David Malpass has become the new World Bank president since I think April 2019, thereabout. All right, the IDA was a much recent arm of the World Bank that was established to provide development assistance too, but to to countries that were not as rich. So it provided very low interest or interest-free loans to developing countries. So developing countries did not have to pay interests on the loans that were given to them as opposed to loans received from the the IRDA, the International Bank, IBRD rather, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. All right. So all these organizations had certain specific objectives. Remember, we said the IMF was concerned more with monetary issues, financial issues, budget, financial reporting, forensics, and all of those issues. The World Bank, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was concerned with development assistance, support for development projects, rebuilding of economies, states, infrastructure that have been broken down by conflict, by wars, and so on and so forth. And then the International Development Association was also in the same line with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but in this instance, they gave interest-free loans, while the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development gave interest loans. You had to pay interest on the loans that were gotten from the IBRD. but the IDA gave interest-free loans. And of course, all these three organizations were members, sorry, all these two organizations rather, the IBRD and the IDA, were members of the World Bank Group. All right. And then the third organization was the GATT, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, of course, which was replaced by the World Trade Organization in 1995. And this basically handles issues of trade. How do we improve trade among states within the international system? How do we promote seamless trade, seamless exchange of commodities, goods, and services? You know, in with very low tariffs, exchange tariffs, import duties, export duties, and what have you. So those are the major issues or concerns of the World Trade Organization. So you have three three major organizations that fall under the Bretton Woods system: the IB, the IMF, rather, the International Monetary Fund; the World Bank Group, which consists of two organizations: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as well as the International Development Association; and then you have the GATT. All four, independent institutions having specific roles, specific objectives that they had to meet. Beyond these global financial organizations, global international financial organization institutions, we also have regional institutions. We have the African Development Bank, we have the Asian Development Bank, and so many other regional financial organizations, institutions that are more invested, just like regional organizations, in the political sense. These regional banks are more invested in supporting development within their own regions, within the African region, within the Asian region. How do we support the rebuilding of, infrastructure? How do we support our exchange rate stability? How do we ensure that the region is growing economically? Those are essentially the objectives of regional banks. So it's just to let you understand that beyond global or international financial organizations, we also have regional organizations that are finance oriented, that are invested in the finance, in the trade, economics of their various regions. Now, there have been debates about the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly in the Global South. The Global South has to do with countries that are developing countries or underdeveloped countries. Those are countries that are classified as the Global South. And the argument has been, how has the Global North, helped? What is the responsibility of the Global North to the Global South? How can they be of assistance, or to what extent have they helped in addressing the issues that the Global South faces? And the two sides to this argument are the practical side and the moral sides to the argument. The practical sides to the argument are more radical, more pragmatic, sides, or more pragmatic arguments that say that, leaders must take responsibility for their states. Leaders are entirely responsible for the prosperity or not of their various states. And of course, that the rich states cannot continue to just dash out money to the weak states, because if that happens, it means that eventually all states will become equal, and that structure of great states, middle states, small states will no longer be there. And so developing countries should take charge of their own development, their economic development, their economic development, political development, social development, and ensure that they rise, given the opportunities they have and resources at their disposal as well. And of course, the moral argument says that, the rich, should assist the poor from time to time. It comes from a more moral perspective. All right, and these are the two sides of the argument. And if you observe international relations, you will see that these two arguments are being given some level of acceptance, or some level of acknowledgement, in the scheme of things. Of course, the new international economic order is one of the ways by which the international system in the global north has responded to the question of the global south as to how well the global north is responding to the issues. The sustainable development goals, the millennium development goals, all of these goals are efforts by the global north to assist in development, in the progress of the global south in entirety. All right. So, of course, the global south perspective of Bretton Woods, you must have heard so many horrible stories about the kind of loans that are given by IMF, the kinds of investments that are made by the World Bank, and all those issues. The global south has always, or has largely, to a very large extent, been skeptical about the Bretton Woods organizations. And some of the arguments has been that, these institutions, perpetuate, have promoted new colonialism, new forms of colonialism. So it means that these institutions have come up with policies that have further, or that have resulted in a new kind of colonial system, of the global south. So global south countries are colonized by the policies that are implemented, established by these institutions. And a second argument is that these institutions are not, they can't feel the need of the global south, so they are removed. They're not in the same context, they are not in the same environment. They don't feel the pressure, they don't feel the need of the global south, and so any kind of response that they give is not going to be fit for the global south, because they don't know where the shoe pinches, literally. All right. And of course, one of such policies has been the structural adjustment program, that was implemented in Africa in the 1970s by the World Bank and by the IMF. And of course, the various negative consequences that these positive and negative consequences, in fact, that this program had for African countries. It helped government to save more money, while at the same time robbing the people of public service goods, or public service, goods, public goods and services that the people ought to have been enjoying. Privatizing several government agencies, electricity, water, communication, and so the citizens have to pay higher for these commodities because they are privately operated, while the government saves a lot of that money. So these are some of the fallouts of some of the Bretton Woods institution policies, that the global south has not been very, very appreciative about. And finally is the issue of the voting system that the World Bank, IMF uses. Of course, policies are voted, and votes are cast by virtue of the contribution that states make to these organizations. So the states that make the most contributions have higher stakes in casting votes, or in the vote casting process, while states that contribute very little, have little or no stake at all. So these are some of the worries, concerns, that global south scholars and diplomats, leaders have had about the Bretton Woods institutions. Some of the actors that have been involved in international finance trade, over the years, are these ones that are listed. You have the G8, the G20, you have the UN Conference on Trade and Development. You have the BRICS, the BRICS New Development Bank, and so on and so forth. All of these organizations have helped one way or the other to advance international trade and finance. You have the Security Commission as well. So all of these are very, very important actors. Now, global economy, global economy is one issue that we also need to pay particular attention to. And the question is, what is global about the economy? How do we how do we tell that an economy is global? You know, of course, there has to be issues of cross-border, trade across border, or economic that goes beyond the border, economics that opens up the border. It means that transactions can go on, within various states without so much restrictions, and of course trade that also transcends, or economics that transcends the border as well, that doesn't even pay attention to whether borders exist or not, and that has been a consequence of internet, increased technology, technological advancement, and communications advancement as well. So the point is that territorial borders, territorial distance, the kilometers that are involved in going from one place to another do not necessarily matter anymore in terms of economic transactions. Economic transactions today have defied distance, have defied borders, and occur regardless of these restrictions. All right. And of course, some of the skeptics, some of those who have said, "Oh, I mean, this is not so new," have argued that these things have existed, from very ancient societies. Ancient societies had dealings with one another. There were cross-border movements, there were cross-border trade, there were cross-border agreements among native communities, and so it's not really a big deal. That's what skeptics have said about global economy. But of course, some have argued that even though these were there in the native societies, of course, it's not at the same scale as we have it today. The scale, the scope, all of that has changed. And that is one thing that needs to be that's one thing that needs to be considered. That's one thing that needs to be considered in our discussion, on global economy. A second issue is global trade. Global trade, and global trade has to do with goods and services, right? How are goods and services exchanged? What is the nature of such production of these goods, production of these services? How are they produced? What resources are used in the production of these goods and services? And of course, how are the goods and services transported? So you find out that production now is also transnational, is also across borders. The resources that are needed in manufacturing a single product might come from several countries altogether. The expertise, the human resources that are needed to couple these resources together to bring about the final product can also come from various continents of the world. So there's what is called the global sourcing. Services are outsourced to companies, organizations that are several miles away, and they carry out these activities just as if they were right there on location. So the nature of production has changed because materials, human resources, material resources, services do not need to be physically provided. It can be provided by proxy, and that is one of the consequences of global trade. There's also been the product. Global products have become global as well. There are certain brands that are global in nature. Some of them are listed there. Some of them, most of these brands can be bought almost anywhere around the world. Wherever you go, the brands are available. So they have become global products, global goods. All right. So not just is production global as well. The goods that are produced, some of them are also global. Some of them exist in many parts of the world at the same time, and that's what global trade means. So not just is economics global, trade is also global, and we see that finance too has assumed a global dimension as well. There's global money, there's global banking, and all of these are efforts that have defied borders, that have defied restrictions, that have largely defied any kinds of tariffs and limitations that are placed by states' boundaries or limitations of trade policies, and what have you. All right. Of course, with your credit card, you can make purchases almost anywhere in the world. You can make purchases online. You don't have to walk into a physical store to purchase whatever good it is you want to purchase. All right. So fund money, currency is no longer it has gone electronic. Currency has gone electronic. Currency has gone electronic. And so that is one evidence of global finance. And also you have things that are called global. Global money includes issues like forex, Bitcoin. You know, there are currencies that are not necessarily visible, to the human eye, but these currencies are accepted as legal tender, you know, especially in transacting business in the electronic space. All right, so these are some of the the definitions of global finance. Global banking. I mean, banking has gone also global. All right, there are banks that do business in multiple countries at the same time. You know, funds are transferred electronically across various continents, across various parts of the world, in just a matter of minutes. So all of these are examples that finance has also gone global. So our argument is that economics has gone global in terms of the fact that in terms of the fact that the economies that we see, just like we said, have become transborder, transnational, have transcended border, and of course it has promoted a collapse in the territories, in the physical distance that have existed for a long time between individuals, in transacting economic activities. We have said that also trade is global, in the sense that production has assumed a global dimension, in the sense that products have also assumed a global dimension. And finally, finance is global because money is no longer physical to the eye. They are global. They are global currencies. They're electronic currencies. Transaction of funds have also gone electronic, and so these are examples of the global nature of economics, finance, and trade. And of course, is this going to continue? Are we going to continue to see a change in international trade and finance? The answer is yes. But of course, as this continues to grow and spread, it is argued that it might result in a further widening of the gap, in inequalities that exist between countries, that exist between individuals, because it appears that the structure of international trade and finance is such that some countries seem to benefit more than other countries, and so if reforms are not done, then that gap may continue to widen. Some countries may continue to gain so much more than other countries are gaining from such international trade and finance. And so the question is, what needs to be done? Reforms are very important. Reforms are very important. The global south, must be considered in the policy making. The peculiarities of the global south should be considered in the policy making. The rise of other other parts of the other countries of the world, other regions of the world should also be considered in the scheme of international trade and finance. And of course, it's important to note on a final note that the territories are still important. So regardless of the fact that economics, finance, and trade have become global, that doesn't undermine the role of physical borders that divide states from one another. All right, states remain sovereign, and of course, states have a significant role to play in global trade and finance. So the sovereignty of states as well is still very much significant, and so cultural diversities, and all of these national attachments, are important, and should be respected to a very large extent. And that's the point we're making. These are some of the reforms that will make international trade and finance a lot more accommodating, a lot more inclusive, and so countries can equally benefit from these growing global, largely liberal international political economy. All right. So this is where we're going to stop this presentation for today on international trade and finance. Of course, if you have questions, if you have concerns and comments, let us continue the conversation via my contact details. And I thank you so much for listening.